see how that goes. Maybe a little bit more. There. We're gonna do last survey. I've never heard anything of this game until I seen it on sale for 85% off. It was like $2.99 Canadian. I think it's $1.99 on the US eShop right now until tomorrow. But yeah, I like choose your own adventure type novels. I think this is teen or up because it asked me on the eShop site for my date of birth. And to Sudbury in the north, Anomia in the Pacific, Salobo in the jungle, and the desolate desert surroundings Mount Keith. I've seen the raw ore ripped from the earth, open pits ablaze, Wurtgen surface extractors chugging diesel, and the burning glow of molten opportunity. I wonder if they mean Sudbury, Ontario. Definitely sound of the world eating itself rings loud in my ears, but now I'm back, returning from my research to share what I've heard. So I don't remember, I don't have any idea what this is rated, I just know it's more than E for everyone because it asked for my date of birth on the eShop when I went to link to it earlier. Arrived at the last stop of my tour, the corporate headquarters of my employer, waiting my scheduled meeting with Victor Ferreira? I took the elevator from the sheer glass and white concrete lobby up to the executive office on the 19th floor. I've only been up here once before to celebrate a dividend payoff last year on the terrace looking out over Guanabara Bay. It was a lovely view, but somewhat bittersweet evening. Couldn't help but feel like the festivities were in a rehearsal for the end of days. Champagne caipirinha were raised and drained in seemingly endless succession. But evidently the well went dry. A fitting symbol of mining operations across the globe. They were all beaming that night. It's nothing but tight lips these days. That's actually really loud. Now I'm summoned again to the top floor, not to rejoice. This time it's panic. I turn that down a bit. On my end. I don't know what on the TV's, on the recording's end. Now I'm summoned again to the top floor, not to rejoice. This time it's panic. Officers were eerily calm. I suppose these top floor types have perfected the nonchalant alarm necessary to command companies whose stock prices determine the economic success of an entire nation's. Where an executive assistant sat me in the designer recliner in a plush waiting area cordoned off by sheets of clear glass. They asked if I'd like anything before meeting with Sir Ferreira. Oh, I might as well get my damn coffee out of this. Didn't sleep well last night, knowing I'd be coming here to deliver my recent round of research. I'm not in fear of any consequences, just more worried that it might mean for those working in our facilities. My voice sees they and our joint ventures in the Kola Peninsula. The Kola Peninsula. Is that a Star Trek reference? A drink arrived in unexpectedly timely fashion, delivered by a new stranger, someone I assumed to be subordinate of my initial greeter. The individual was probably the assistant to the executive assistant, or perhaps a junior executive assistant. Either way, they smiled sheepishly and passed me the ceramic cup and saucer with steady hands. They clearly did not know the news I was about to deliver. I could peer through the maze-like interior to spy on other nearly identical waiting areas of other company dignitaries. Through similarly adorned and fashioned, this antechamber was slightly larger. I looked up on how long to beat. It took about an hour, so we'll see. But I'm sure there's multiple endings and branching paths and all that. Further down the hallway, there's also a scattering of meeting rooms concealed by drawn blinds. The rooms looked empty at the moment, but they had undoubtedly been buzzing with recent activity. Blinds still swayed slightly from the leftover breeze created from suites quickly being buttoned after a swift round of decision-making. Suits quickly being buttoned. Consider how many decisions have been made on this floor, sealing the fate of thousands of workers from Mozambique to New Caledonia. Their faces flashed before me, stark-hard eyes beneath layers of earth and grease. The strip miners and Zorowacco wore reflective UV glasses. I remember the rail yard workers. Uncle Puma. Idling caterpillar trucks waiting to bring their cargo to the metallurgist further silenced the already hushed murmur of the Soloco canteen. My guide didn't bother translating their muted chatter, but I could clearly see they knew just as I did that their time in Sulawesi was running short. I spoke to many drillers and loaders during my trip, but not necessarily for my research. I felt that the technical data was only telling one side of the story. The other half could be told by the men and women who worked the floors up to 60 hours a week. Hazardous work conditions across the company as global operations are well documented, and the scant attention paid to safety has resulted in some very public disasters. Some of my employer's subordinate officers would take personal offense to my assessments, call my remarks outright insulting, but the real effrontery is bearing witness to the almost absent expectations workers have for their bosses to uphold national safety regulations. Oh, I don't fault the pit bosses and foremen. I blame the double-breasted, two-faced lobbyists who solicit lenient inspection through bribery and coercion, practice long maintained by global industrialism. Still in all, whoever is responsible, the burden is most visibly carried by the miners themselves, slung over shoulders and repurposed burlap sacks lashed around waists of burning nylon rope, gripped by blistered hands that will never fully heal. Up here, sitting in this corporate vestibule, amplified the distance between what happens in the ground and what happens behind a desk. The vantage from the 19th floor was cash positive. Liquidity was up, debt down, shareholders appeased, margins stabilized. But analysis remained their skepticism. Rightfully so. I wasn't the first to conduct surveys, but my employment is unique in that the scope of my findings eclipses any other prospector study. My worry, shared by many of my academic peers, is that my work will not see daylight until it's already too late. I was witnessing a proverbial race to the bottom, into the pit, into the earth, for the very last dollar, to the deepest depth. Waiting to be ushered into St. Ferreira's suite, into Senor Ferreira's suite, I did not find much solace in my preparations. At one point, I was comforted by the thought that my research would make a difference, one way or another. Even if I couldn't personally halt operations, I imagined my survey as a hand on the lever, ready to pull once the word came from upstairs. Now sitting upstairs, I can't muster that same confidence. Not that I don't believe my argument is convincing. The blinders resting in my letter satchel clearly outlined a dire situation. As research was unambiguous and forthright, in the final concluding pages of Section 12, ironically, the first page I expect Senor Ferreira to read, my message is resoundingly clear. You're fucked. The rest of the binder was existentially padding. Soften the blow, a pillow in front of the pistol. It was tempting to savor my complimentary drink of Basil attempt to ice my nerves. My twitching knees belayed any sense of composure, even an ample air-conditioning sweat beaded down my temples. But our first encounter was at a geoscience conference hosted by the University of Melbourne, sponsored by BHP. It was atypical for senior executives to attend academic gatherings, but he was on a personal recruitment mission. He approached me after I had delivered a paper on alloy yield degeneration using current extraction methods. We walked through Carlton Gardens and had dinner staring at the spotlit Parliament building. After a barrage of questions about my research, he offered me a consultancy with a retainer that made me blush. I tried to be coy and said that I'd have to think it over, but I found myself accepting the position even before he ordered dessert. This is hard because I don't have much voice. It seemed as though more than enough time had passed for word my arrival to reach Victor's inner chamber. I should expect the natural delays that plague operations of this magnitude. I'd come to expect Victor's attention being pulled in a million directions at once. It comes with the territory of the 19th floor. I didn't realize this game was not going to be this. I figured it, choose your adventure, like Lifeline style. But this is large gaps of text exposition before the choices. Can't be up here if you aren't juggling several meetings simultaneously, writing an email while talking on speakerphone, reading a report while watching the stock tickers, signing off on public memos while placating shareholders. Victor, like most executives I've met, was a quarry of cognitive dissidence. You could smell the miasma of doublespeak seeping out his pores. Like most men in power, he could talk at length without really saying anything, hurling countless syllables and sentences at your general direction, without taking a position one way or another about any particular topic. A breeze of words that wafted from his mouth could be interpreted as chilly or balmy. It would merely depend on your temperature and temperament. So we get confirmation bias talk, then. His talk was engineered to be that way, manufactured a careful verbal lexicon of convincing neutrality. For Victor, language was a mirror, a shield of glass that could tilt his way, and that to represent the best vantage of yourself back to you. Somehow, every time I heard him speak, I found myself forming an opinion. I instinctively react, formulating responses and criticism, assuming I was in the midst of a conversation. It's only much later, after trying to digest his shards of discourse, that you realize, as I do time and time again, that you're mostly talking to yourself. In truth, he was more magician than executive. The door to the waiting room squealed on its hinge. The original assistant who greeted me at the elevator asked me to follow her to Senior Ferreira's office. She didn't wait for my confirming reply and started down the hallway before I had fully gathered my binder-filled briefcase. The swish of my linen pants and the clatter of the assistant's heels reverberated in the vacuum of the hallway. I was led to the massive study double doors, flanked by identical receptionist desks. My guide stood to the side and gestured for me to advance through the midnight-stained teak doors. My hour had come. I cleared my throat and walked in. But I was stymied by a brisk command to halt any further entry. I scanned the room in search of the owner of my hostile welcome, but Victor was not to be found. I realized the shout came from behind a cracked door that must have led to an even more private room, the executive bathroom. I heard turn a faucet and the handle wash. Water splashed in the hidden basin. I didn't knock because I was invited in. And almost immediately, running water ceased and Victor's office became a cavern of stillness. He threw open the door with a scowl without speaking, gestured at me to take a seat. To regain my composure, I shuffled into the room and took the most immediate seat I could find. Victor stood. He loomed there like stratocumulus formulations I saw in the Malacca Strait, a high pillar ready to rain down on me. His face was a picture of stress, deeply lined with worries, undercolored from poor eating habits, ready from overactive socializing. And he held himself the way that more than mere confidence, his continence was a challenge, an invitation to best wits, a barrier of power. He was an offspring of Prometheus, a bringer of fire, a trickster sculptor who forged civilization as an act of defiance. That's another thing I have a problem with when I do captures, because PlayStation, you hold to take a capture, like you press and hold, take a capture, and on Switch, you hold to take a video. As physical person belayed these projections, for his stature wasn't what you would call imposing. Victor was the model of executive physique, bland. He wasn't tall or short, wide or trim, barrel-chested or sunken. He was a man in between, perhaps at one point more chiseled, but not fully in a state of decline. Passing glance would say that he was handsome, but was more inoffensive than picturesque. But that was Victor, an anonymous silhouette encased in an unmistakable presence. My bag rested on my lap like a corpse. I folded my hands over the damning continent's side as if preparing for the final sermon of my research before sending it into the great beyond. This is how I imagine I must have looked. because I took a deep breath to launch into a speech when Victor interjected. Keep it short. I inhaled at the interrupter, protruding my mouth in exasperation. Frowning at the thought of merely following his crude directive, I plucked the binders from my bag and held out one for Victor to examine. He hesitated, but eventually slid across the carpet floor to meet where I sat. In one motion, he reached into his jacket to retrieve his reading glasses and started immediately, leaping past my introductory statements. Cursory glimpse past my citation and footnotes, passing occasionally on graphs with downward trajectories. We didn't speak while he paged through my analysis. Victor became absorbed in the research. With my packet in hand, he stood in order to pace about the room. Couldn't tell if it was a good or bad sign. However, I noticed his meanders weren't orderly as I expected. He didn't merely strut back and forth or walk around in a circle. Instead, he zigzagged about his domain, etching secret runes into the imported tapestry that covered most of the floor. Watching him, I realized I hadn't properly acquainted myself with the furniture of this palatial office. It was impressive, but not outright gaudy. A decorator's touch was noticeable, but not heavy-handed. I could see moments where the CEO had intervened to satisfy his own ego. Typical framed pictures with smiling international dignitaries were discreetly regulated to the cabinet near the entrance, but the cabinet of trophies, awards, and various notable accolades that I would expect to see in the office of this magnitude and prestige was absent. Space that would have been dedicated to such things is instead occupied by pictures of his family and posed photo ops with pit bosses and engineering staff at various facilities, signaling to anyone visiting my employees are like my family. I didn't think of Victor as a sentimental type, so I assumed the arrangement of photos must have been a strategic decision. I imagined him during negotiations walking visitors over to this area, telling a very compelling tearjerker in order to sway the attitudes of his adversary. He leaned in close, almost whispering in the ear of his interlocutor, reciting a story with a tactical tone of empathy and compassion. The victim could be moved, clearing their throat or adjusting their tie. He would tell Victor that they'd reconsider the position or withdraw their complaint, whatever it may be. I wondered if he tried that maneuver on me. More importantly, I questioned whether I would have the willpower to withstand his maneuver. My scrutiny of Victor's interior decoration was further piqued by the lack of televisions. In many offices I wandered into over the years, the low-volume murmuring of a flat screen was a common fixture. Besides the pair of split-screen monitors stationed at his desk, Victor's office was remarkably tech-free. Even the lobby had a couple of TVs playing welcoming messages with brightly tinted infographics and stock photos of happy workers. Absence of screens made me reconsider Victor's focus. Regardless of his determination to seek the information and act accordingly was, as far as I could tell, a marked difference from his competitors, but I wondered if this research was merely a point of leverage for Victor's vision of the future of his company. Would he share my findings? Would he set in motion the drastic and necessary changes needed to avoid catastrophe? I was also having problems with some of these words because they're not, English Canadian, English UK spelling. Near the end of the section 8, my analysis of solvent extraction alloy leaching when he peered over the rim of his glasses to meet my gaze. He soured, puckering his face in preparation for a bitter assessment of my work. This doesn't look good. I nodded solemnly, interlocking my fingers over the open copy of dossier on my lap. No, Victor, it doesn't. I thought you knew this already. He acted in consternation, folded his glasses with one hand, stood in the middle of the room. He surveyed his domain, assessing the impeding fall of a kingdom under his reign. Eyes darting back and forth, Victor calculated the various possible outcomes of what he had just read. He shuddered slightly, squeezing his lips into a tight, thin line as if having just drank a double shot of Cachesa. I don't know if that's the right. Placing his glasses back upon the bridge of his nose, he returned to my docking where he had left off. Taking long, emphasized strides, he moved behind his desk, pulled out his chair, and slowly eased into its padded seat. The chair rocked to a rhythmic squeal that Victor didn't seem to notice. I couldn't read his silence, as I pensitively remained still. I inhaled deeply, releasing a slow sigh, repeating thus far hadn't exactly met my expectations. Sudden emotional attachments I was feeling for my emotionless presentation of data gave me a dizzying sensation, as if the minor sway of the 19th floor and the Brazilian breeze was making me nauseous. Gravity was playing tricks on me. The heaviness of this room, the density of my dismay, the weight of my research bore down on me I'm probably going to butcher this because I've never said it out loud. A faceless hammer pounded against my heart. Victor gave me no sign of capitulating to my concerns. I was beginning to wonder if he would even notice if I had just gotten up and left. For all I knew, he was probably expecting it. Victor breezed through the next several sections, realizing as I had initially estimated that what he really cared about was the conclusion. I turned to the sound of papers flipping against themselves as he flipped to the end of my briefing. He reared his body up from the fortress he called a desk, and again made the face of tasting something gone off. He clicked his tongue once or twice as if to prepare the room for more violent noises that were about to emanate from a space and disturb over-muted surroundings. But instead he cleared his throat and said, "So, we're in deep shit." I half gasped his summation, partially out of relief, partially out of unexpected brevity. Ventured in response, "The shit is only as deep as you dig, Victor. That's one way of putting it." I'll say the first one. Global mineral rare earth metal fatigue was within our lifetime. At the current rate of ore depletion, the next generation will consider the pickaxe obsolete. I spoke with urgency and passion, wondering if the statements didn't seem like outright pleading. I tried to rephrase the scientific abstruseness of my research into terms that would strike a chord with Victor's mechanical heart. I could sense my explanation was not exactly satisfactory to Victor, as if every word I spoke further creased his taut poker face. I see the clenching and unclenching of his jaw, the muscles bulging his temple, and tight rhythm that matched his wispy nasal breathing. My eyes searched for expression for any sign of receptiveness, but, as I come to expect from Victor's acidic stare, very little indication that my impurities were not met with any kind of sympathy. The veins stretched over his tensing jaw pulsed with quiet energy. It was clear that all my statements were being measured against his bottom line, a series of calculations that even I couldn't predict. I continued off my professional opinions, despite Victor's obviously growing impatience, and I felt that the veracity of my claims was slipping through my own grasp. I could tell I was starting to spiral, not quite free fall, but absurdly pinwheeling into obscurity. Empathizing oblique data points was not going to assist my case. Victor already read between the lines. He already saw the hidden message nestled between bargraphs and histograms. He hadn't come to this far without being able to detect the subtlety of data. I hesitated a moment to catch my breath. I tried to disguise an inward sigh that came with my exaggerated inhale. Arch eyebrows flashed across Victor's face, and he placed the binder into the absurdly low coffee table that rested in front of me. I noticed Victor had already earmarked some of the pages so that his henchmen could dissect my research at a later date. Maybe they were dog-eared for his PR goons to appropriate for positive spin. It could be that Victor saw something in those pages that I didn't, or noticed discrepancies that I had somehow overlooked. My speculation was veering into self-doubts, a sign that no matter what my approach had been up to this point, Victor had put me in the defensive. I had to readjust. Victor crossed his arms, possibly sensitive about to change tactics. All this is pretty influential. None of what I said is actually news to you, is it? Regardless, my strategy, ill-advised, as it seemed to have some positive effects. He moved his glasses in the same exaggerated motion as before and pressed his chin on his palm in the rehearsed faux-thinking pose, rubbing the day-old stubble peppered on his liver-spot jawline. Victor contemplated adjusting a schoolmaster in training attitude. He cleared his throat, whipping his hands behind his back, smacking them together as he clasped them in place to maintain his peacocking posture. Some of it is news. He frowned at his own response, realizing that any amount of honesty afforded to me might be a mistake. I could tell he was a man that didn't enjoy being off guard. He was unused to conversing, more accustomed to giving commands. I grinned meekly in acquiescence. The minor details in the senior's reception to my report gave me some idea of his leanings, but I still couldn't tell that the discussion was going to alter the direction of our immediate troubles. I'm sure Victor could sense my unease, but I too could tell that holding a meeting for longer than 15 minutes in his personal office with anyone other than a potential acquisition executive was a rare activity. Possibly it was grating to him that the conversation has gone on as long as it did, expecting instead that I merely deliver my news and make a quick exit. A crisp, synthesized chirp interrupted the dampened room. Victor's desk phone was ringing. He lingered in the middle of the room, refusing to even look in the direction of the noise emanating from the russet surface. sound erupted again this time, sending Victor into an oddly dignified fit of movement in order to descend into the VoIP had set the staunch, well-knuckled temper. Wait! Melted across the room, glancing at me. I'll just be a moment. Even as unexpected, Victor wouldn't let any minor interruptions halt his opportunity to have the last word with me, even if unexpected. Collecting himself, he snatched the handle of the receiver and tersely alerted whoever was on the other end that their sudden presence about remote was unwelcome at the moment. He pinched his face, and severe brow softened momentarily. His eyes twitched back and forth as if he was reading an invisible memo trapped inside his skull. His initial instinct to berate the caller now seemed uncalled for and made me deeply curious as to the content of their conversation. Victor read my obvious eavesdropping, glared at me before sitting down to swivel his back to me. His tone turned gentle, speaking slow and brief. Caller did most of the talking. I could make out heavily compressed sing-song cadence from the earpiece. It sailed into the room at a decibel just barely higher than the HVAC, interspersed with Victor's affirming grunts and tender, agreeing phrases. He spoke a combination of Portuguese and English, peppering industry jargon with more personal phrases. Maybe this was another facet of his executive acumen, a hidden, compassionate tone to balance his otherwise ruthlessness. But I was only assuming that this was the case, since when it came to the actual business side of how the company ran, I had trouble deciphering the economics of it all. Finance was never my strong suit. For me to pretend that I knew how Victor actually behaved as an executive was misleading, since I had hardly ever seen it firsthand. I could only glean his activities via the occasional newspaper clipping or Bloomberg interview. His reputation was well regarded, but that standing was amongst other like-minded global capitalists. I'll be right back. I'm going to check what that beep was on my phone. Oof. It was just the reminder for me that Otaku Boot Camp had opened up for in Obey Me, even though I had checked in game earlier. I suppose my distrust for Victor wasn't personal. It was grounded in an avid skepticism of people like him, men in power, men making decisions that gravely affect people, communities, and cultures. I could never admire men like him, mostly because they only admire men like themselves. Victor's phone call was dragging on, but he seemed content to stay on the line. I was starting to grow uncomfortable in my over-designed seat, staring down at the cover of my binder. Possible futility of further conversation started to dawn on me. I could sit still any longer. I was quietly stretch my legs, start to pack my belongings. No, we're going to stay here. Fairly uninspired composition, unquestionably expensive. The piece could easily complement any boardroom or presidential suite decor. Imagine the creator actually laboring to achieve this level of inoffensiveness. Beyond innocuous, the artwork actually had a sublime, forgetful quality that its author had probably spent several decades honing. I wonder if the maker had imagined their life's work leading up to this moment, entombed as an ornament for businessmen wanting to appear culturally refined. Just checking how my, how something's coming. Only 9% uploaded. Okay. I wonder if the maker had imagined their life's work. Yeah. But then again, who am I to talk? Here I was, my research meant to appease a different kind of insecurity. I wasn't giving the artists enough credit. Maybe their piece was never actually intended for Victor, but rather meant for people like me that never thought they'd end up in scenarios like this. Victor abruptly spun around to place his elbows on the desk, following my movement with a rather uncharacteristic blank stare. Still talking on the phone, he spoke in deliberately louder English than I could clearly hear his side of the conversation. Yes, I'm with them right now. We're going over the survey. Not good, no. Not good at all. I'll call you back later. Ciao. Sally placed the receiver back down, clicking it back into place with aggressive emphasis. The combination of casual demeanor and honest assessment convinced me he must have been talking to someone he held in very high esteem. Possibly an intimate confidant, or even a back-channel competitor. The mere fact they didn't immediately dismiss their call was evidence enough to assume the caller was someone even Victor couldn't refuse. Maybe he secretly timed the phone call to give him a strategic break in our dialogue, like a nervous date asking a friend to call them in 5 minutes in order to make an excuse for postponing the remainder of the awkward evening. That seemed petty at best. The phone call must have been unplanned regardless of its welcome break from dealing with my discoveries. Crossed myself standing in the middle of the room, striking a pose that deserved an explanation. He remained seated, removing his deeply veined hand from the receiver, resting his arm atop his ergonomically sculpted armrests. Unwilling to endure another stalemate, I opened the pickup line we left up. To understand the gravity of my findings, the result of a survey have far-reaching implications. The gravity of my findings. I'm going to pick that one just because, I hope you understand. The problem wasn't merely that Victor could have shut down lines, the metallurgy facilities, and canceled contracts with Mitsui. It was bigger than that. The current rate of depletion would curb production of some of the world's most necessary electronics and green infrastructure components. Motherboards and anodized panels become prohibitively expensive to manufacture, stalling markets that rely on the minerals and metals that Victor's company was readily supplying. And we've already had that. And then we had a fucking awful thing with the new increase in NFTs and blockchain and all that fucking shit. Making components even more prohibitively expensive to most consumers and delaying things. And yet still, despite that, companies like Google and such continue with the forced obsolescence. Like you can't upgrade because you don't have the money to buy the now greatly priced system, and there's no cheaper options available due to scarcity, but we're still going to make it obsolete. If news ever broke out that the world's supply of nickel was at the point of exhaustion, renegade or unexpected seizure of facilities would result in an international global conflicts. I might have Victor that his enterprise now and always had been political. My survey didn't change that fact, it pushed further into the fore. A senior arose from his creaking desk. Digesting my analysis, he nodded to himself several times, silently, solemnly, without projecting any solutions he might be arriving at. He scratched at his temples. My statements weren't exactly revolutionary, but I felt it my duty to say them. Victor needed to know that this was not just a pet project of his. His information contained in my binder painted the bleak picture, to be sure. Victor understood the complexity of what my research presented, and I didn't want to harangue him into action. Presenting any kind of ultimatum would be a non-starter. I had no power or leverage to do so. Besides, the NDA signed presented a litigious scenario that I couldn't physically or mentally afford. I had seen colleagues destroyed by unruly sponsors, unsatisfied with funded research. Friends and peers alike had been stripped of status at the hands of dark money and shell corporations. Nowadays, whistleblowers, even in countries with so-called stable democracies, have been put in the crosshairs, some crushed in the courts, others blackmailed into silence, and others still put into physical peril. Price of speaking truth and power come with a high premium. These thoughts crept through my mind as I waited Victor's response. At any point, he still could call in security, confiscate my passport, smash my phone, shred my survey, and altogether deny the existence of my work, or my life for that matter. Did he have that kind of authority? Was he someone that could just erase a person off the face of the planet? He certainly had the power to do this with minerals extracting their worth, and then forgoing any consequences. What could be so different with people? My paranoia was starting to spiral out of control, but I couldn't help but think my typical overcautious suspicions weren't completely unfounded. I tried to silently fish my phone when Victor noticed I was getting nervous. Is everything all right? Your silence makes me uncomfortable. I explained that I thought our meeting would be more of a conversation, a dialogue of concerned individuals about the future. Instead, I found myself supplying information to a pinstripe, stone-faced, barrier-fortified, and an elevated concrete bunker. It's not a conversation about my research, but instead a quiet judgment. I was on the verge of letting up the pent up anger I was harboring when Victor motioned in his outstretched hand for me to slow down. Cool your jets, buddy. I said I understood some of the frustration thing. Acknowledging the thoroughness of my report was undoubtedly underappreciated by his initial scan. He walked toward with a grooved palm facing upwards, pantomimed that he had nothing to hide. He put on his best intentioned face, stretching his skin around his temples as he feigned a concerned smile. Victor apologized for not being more loquacious, his words, not mine. Emptying his lungs revealed a hidden fragility. It's how that he wanted to justify his perspective, providing anecdotes of tough decisions he had made in the past. He spoke about his ascension to the 19th floor from unlikely roots and previous employers, reminiscing about his days as an insurance executive as he smirked. Much of what he was doing now was similar to the work he had done then, assessing risks, measuring the world's pitfalls against its opportunities, tempering hopes against fears, finding every potential to squeeze profit out of tragedy. In a minute, the work troubled him initially, using abstract formulas in order to determine best-case scenarios for an alienating experience. This modern method stood in stark contrast to the face-to-face business mentorship of previous generation. In time, he said, he realized that these new analytical tools would only become more pervasive. Not because shareholders had found new, supposedly exciting ways to thicken their portfolios, but because it gave men like him platforms to mitigate their guilty conscience. A freedom, again, Victor's term, and one I would rarely use in this instance. These models afforded were too enticing for any individual that had harbored any moral scruples. Now, hard decisions were computational machines, providing the executive class an out for their inhumanity. Yeah, the whole, I'll blame the numbers, Now, this isn't exactly what Victor was saying. I was interpreting the mealy-mouthed verbal gymnastics he posed for justifying whatever decision he came to at the end of our conversation. I let him pratter on, tracing the circumference of his liberalistic perspective with self-congratulating phrases. This was one of those moments where I could tell I was merely an object in the room to change the timbre of Victor's voice as it bounced around the room, a sonic dampening to remind Victor he wasn't alone. Being a fleshy muffler wasn't meant for me. I interrupted, so what are we going to do now? Sounds like nothing has changed. The remainder of the sentence trickled out of his mouth like the last drops of mercury from a burst thermometer. Words splashed softly on the floor, solidifying on the carpet a deep stain on Victor's pride. I gaped, stunned and boiling, said, "What made you think I'd tell you that?" He spat the words, cheeks reddening, nostrils flaring, clenched his jaw. I could hear the crown caps of his teeth grinding against each other, fake enamel turning to fine powder. I stood fast, waiting for another report, another emulsion, another typical expression of self-appointed superiority, waiting for response fueled my own inner rage, the anger that had been seething since taking this job. Anger of excavation, dug up over and over again, for every site of visit saw with shoddy conditions and back-breaking labor. The anger that sank deep, a plumb line weighted with the heaviness that only the most bitter instruments could measure. Anger so dense, thicker than any alloy bonded together, so strong that no shelter could no smelter could distill, no sintering could liquefy. Yeah, this is kind of like a glass response, because it's like, I thought it would be like, so what are we going to do now? And now it's escalating. I prepared to leave. I couldn't bring myself to continue this conversation any longer. Victor didn't stop me. He didn't bother to feign attempt at imploring me to stay. Very close felt heavier than when I had arrived, pulling at my shoulder, straining the socket. Fighting my fingers, I inhaled deeply, raising my chest to align my spine, muscled voluntarily. You're better than this. You can stop this. My plea was met with tepid enthusiasm. Victor didn't need his ego inflated more than it already was. But I wasn't pandering to his desire for a lasting legacy. I was clinging onto the hope that Victor's keen sense of opportunity might outweigh his desire to maintain the status quo. Flickers of imagination sparked behind a stoic stare, and I struggled to communicate what should at the very least think about it. I considered the magazine profiles, accolades, and the clamoring congratulations from all sides. But this wasn't what that motivated Victor. Glory was not his game. I'll take what you report into consideration. Victor couldn't be swayed with righteousness or altruism, because he couldn't act on their unprecedented outcome. There was no model to account for selfishness because it had no bottom line. One could blame his education or his upbringing or the elitist culture that bred Victor's attitude. One could cite his mentoring or the corrupting advice of former superiors or the underhanded behaviors of his peers. But if one wanted to pinpoint when, where, and how Victor became the man he stood before me, the apathetic apparition that he is and would always be, one would never be hard-pressed to come up with concrete answers. He buried his hands in his pocket after a long pause, indicating me that conversation had reached its natural conclusion. Victor looked in my general direction, but refused to meet my eyes. Eventually, he turned to face the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the teeming bay below. I imagined him standing long after my departure, watching the paragliders and tourists basking in the warm sun. From Victor's standpoint, those bodies below were all part of one whole, a constituent of potential clients, populace of customers. I wondered if he would consider how his own products would be their undoing. Those bodies would turn to dust, under the unbeating sun, but he would be shielded up here, sheltered by the cool concrete of the 19th floor. I spoke up my bag and saw myself out. There was no receptionist waiting for me on the other side of the Victor heavy doors, no greeting party to usher me into oblivion. I wished for someone to come to muster comfort as I engrossed the threshold back into the crumbling reality of an ignorant world. But there was no one there, no shepherd, no guide, no ferryman to help me cross the river Styx. I meandered back to the elevator, waiting for it to envelop me in the aluminum and steel cage, bring me back down to the surface, back to earth, back down. The lobby floor indicator ding jolted me out of my daze. I lingered for a moment before shuffling out into the vacacious lobby. Halting to what felt like the precise middle of this cavernous space, I felt like an immense isolation. My bag, now half empty, sagged in my limp fist. Side held a ruin, the remnants of my life, all those lives that will be devastated by what will come next. My ears rang with the high-pitched squeals that emanated from security clearance kiosks. Employees scanned their badges, tipped their hat to the on-duty officer, stretching meek smiles topped with pretend politeness. I wondered if the pain of putting all those faces was due to some internal conflict, was making effort to appear content with aiding what ails the planet more strained than I imagined. The passive wave of the officer, the nonchalant nod of the understanding smoothed over their guilt. Did they have any such remorse? It's hard to tell at this distance, a span measured in meters and morals, a length whose dimension I no longer knew how to quantify. I had spent the last year trying to mold my observations into data, turn estimates into certainties, trying to perform what tasks now seemed beyond foolish. How does one map human decisions? There is no algorithm to resolve a conflicting self, no equations for solving the human spirit. Maybe therein lies the flaw of thinking I could do anything to change Victor's mind. He and all those men in power who shaped the world with all their well-reasoned yet ill-fated decisions is not a variable in some computation. His manner, his motivation, his presence will always fall outside the scope of my survey. For all my projections, he will always retain the one fact that will prevent solutions from reaching a place of equality. I'm guessing I got a bad end. But it can't be all left up to men like Victor. Time is coming yet. Time for Victor's choices will catch up to him. Time for the choices I and others make will undo all they've done. A survey. An essay game by Nicholas O'Brien. Soundtrack Louis Kopenhofer. Assistant Art Director Rebecca Sass. Nicholas O'Brien. Copyright. We go to credits this time. Yeah. Playtesters. I'm guessing that's it. Guessing I got bad in, but who knows? Yeah, I also bought Lonely Assassins, the mobile and Switch Doctor Who game, The Lonely Angels, because it was on sale. Ordered by numbers I got because I'm going to buy a physical version of it probably, but it was under $10 on sale, so I snatched that up. There's Twitch, Deltarune 1 and 2, that was free. I've never played Deltarune, I've only played Undertale. Go Princess Maker Go Princess. I want to play through that sometime. one of the a whole map. That takes so long. I played 2, but I didn't finish the first one because I didn't know it wasn't auto-saving. And I got so fed up that I closed the app, and then I went back later and my progress wasn't there. Because I had horrible luck. Among Us. I have it on PlayStation as well. Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild I got pre-ordered when it released, and World's End Club, which was the only one I was eligible to get the coins for, and then there's All Software. Which, you know, Tetris 99. I like Tetris 99. I enjoyed playing it, especially the challenges with teams, but it kept, like, the controller kept dying when I would get in the top 10. I was ranked 9 and the controller, like, decided it wasn't responding anymore. So I was like, I was just disgusted by it. I bought that because that was like, I think 99 cents when I first got the Switch. Super Entertainment System. And the Pac-Man. Where's Nintendo, you know. And the only ones I had to re-download are Sega and whatnot, because I didn't realize you needed the expansion pack for them. So yeah, that's that. Murder by Numbers, I should mention too, is the character design and art direction is from Hato King, Hato Moa, the one who did Hateful Boyfriend. So I wanted that just to support them, because Hateful Boyfriend's like, I love it so much. But yeah, I mostly just played Animal Crossing and watched YouTube if I'm too lazy to get up and use my PlayStation 1. But ciao.